An elderly woman, upon receiving news of her daughter's death, rushed to the hospital. But when the coffin was opened, everyone was stunned, completely paralyzed. "You think you're better than me, Vivian." Victor's voice echoed in her head like a haunting melody. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. His face, once a source of comfort and promise, had twisted into something unrecognizable. Vivienne closed her eyes, but the memory of that night stayed, vivid as the neon lights outside her window. It had started so innocently. Vivienne, barely 20, was working late at the bookstore when Victor strolled in. He had a kind of presence that made people turn their heads, a mix of confidence and mystery. Vivienne, shy and reserved, had rarely given men a second thought. But there was something about him. When he struck up a conversation, her usual hesitance melted away. For once, she felt seen, as if he could peer straight into her soul and pull her into a world far beyond her own quiet life. Within months, she'd found herself daydreaming about a future she never thought possible. A home, a family, laughter ringing through the halls. Victor painted it all so vividly for her. "You'll never have to worry again," he'd promised, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll take care of everything." And she believed him. But then, life had a way of pulling the rug out from under you, just when you thought you finally found your footing. "Victor, I'm pregnant." Her voice had been soft, almost apologetic, as if she were confessing a mistake. She remembered the way he froze, his hand mid-reach for the coffee cup. Slowly, he looked up, and, for a brief moment, she saw the man she thought she loved, the one who whispered sweet dreams into her ear. But then his face changed. "You can't be serious," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you know what this will do to my life? To our life?" "Our life?" Vivienne's voice trembled. "I thought this was what we wanted, Victor. You said—" "I said," he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I wasn't ready for something like this. We're young, Vivienne. This isn't the time for a kid. You have options. Take care of it, and we'll move on." Her heart sank like a stone in a lake. "Take care of it?" she repeated, as though the words were foreign. "You mean—" "I'm not raising a child," he said flatly, standing up and grabbing his jacket. He turned to her one last time, his eyes cold. "It's either me or this. This thing. Your choice." And with that, he was gone. The shame had been suffocating. In a small town like theirs, secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Within days, whispers trailed her wherever she went. Vivienne could feel the weight of their judgmental stares every time she stepped out. "Poor girl," some would murmur, though their pity was laced with scorn. Others weren't as kind. "Did you hear? She's knocked up and the guy left her." Figures. Even friends she thought she could rely on had begun to drift away, their polite excuses like daggers to her already bruised heart. But it wasn't the gossip that stung the most. It was the uncertainty. She had no family to lean on, no safety net, just herself and the tiny life growing inside her. Late at night, when the house was quiet, doubts would creep in like shadows. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe she wasn't ready for this. How could she, when the world seemed so determined to watch her fail? But then, almost as if on cue, a flutter beneath her ribs would remind her of why she was fighting. Lena came into her life on one of those long, lonely nights. The fluorescent hum of the 24-hour convenience store had become a strange sort of comfort for Vivienne as she worked to scrape together what little she could. Lena, with her warm smile and an air of quiet confidence, had been a regular customer. She always greeted Vivienne by name, always asked how her day was going. One evening, as Vivienne rang up Lena's order, her fatigue must have shown more than usual. "Long day?" Lena asked, her tone gentle but probing. Vivienne hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." Lena didn't press, but her gaze lingered, and Vivienne could feel it, kind but piercing. "If you ever need someone to talk to," she said, slipping a business card across the counter, "give me a call." It wasn't until days later, when Vivienne found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, that she dialed the number. Lena turned out to be more than just a kind stranger. She was a beacon of hope. Over steaming cups of tea at her cozy kitchen table, Vivienne poured out her story. She expected judgment or pity. Instead, Lena listened quietly, nodding here and there, her eyes full of understanding. "Being a mother," Lena said softly, "isn't easy. But you'd be surprised how strong you are when it's for someone you love." With Lena's guidance, Vivienne began to piece her life back together. Lena introduced her to resources for single mothers, helped her find steadier work, and offered both practical advice, emotional support. Vivienne sat in the dim light of her small living room, her hand resting on her belly as if to shield the little life inside. Her mind wandered to Lena's words from the previous evening. "You're stronger than you think, Vivienne," Lena had said, her voice calm but firm. For the first time in months, Vivienne felt like she could believe it. The months passed in a blur of work and preparation. Despite the exhaustion that came from working double shifts and the nagging stares of the townsfolk, Vivienne stayed focused on one thing: the child she was about to bring into the world. Every penny she earned was carefully saved, every purchase considered. She wanted this child to have everything she didn't: safety, love, and the promise of a brighter future. When the day finally came, it was both terrifying and transformative. The pain was unlike anything Vivienne had ever imagined, but the moment she heard the first cry of her newborn daughter, everything else melted away. "She's perfect," the nurse said, gently placing the baby in Vivienne's arms. Vivienne looked down at the tiny face, still pink and scrunched up from the ordeal of birth, and felt tears spill over her cheeks. "Carolina," she whispered, "you're my Carolina, and I promise I'll never let you down." The baby, as if understanding the promise, quieted in her arms. For the first time in what felt like forever, Vivienne felt whole. Raising Carolina wasn't easy, but it was worth every sleepless night and every ounce of energy Vivienne could muster. She juggled 3 part-time jobs, taking shifts at a diner, a cleaning service, and an overnight gig at a grocery store. Her days were a blur of work and caring for her daughter, but no matter how tired she was, she never skipped their nightly routine. "Mommy's home," Vivienne would say softly, leaning over the crib. Carolina's face would light up, her little arms reaching for her mother. It didn't matter how hard the day had been. Those moments erased all the fatigue. When Carolina was old enough to understand, Vivienne began to weave lessons into their bedtime stories. She told her daughter tales of brave little girls who worked hard and never gave up, who helped others and found happiness in the simplest things. Vivienne wanted Carolina to grow up knowing the value of kindness and perseverance. "You're my little star," she'd whisper after tucking Carolina in, brushing her daughter's curls back from her forehead. "Always remember, family is what matters most. We take care of each other no matter what." As Carolina grew, it became clear she was special. By the time she was 10, her teachers couldn't stop praising her curiosity and intelligence. Carolina soaked up knowledge like a sponge, excelling in every subject. But her talents didn't stop there. She was also a natural athlete. Whether it was on the soccer field or the basketball court, Carolina had a drive that made her unstoppable. Vivian attended every game, no matter how busy her schedule was. She'd sit in the stands, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her daughter lead her team. "That's my girl," she'd whisper to herself, clapping and cheering louder than anyone else. Carolina, in turn, adored her mother. She would run into Vivian's arms after every game, her face beaming with excitement. "Did you see, Mum? I scored the winning goal." "I saw, sweetheart," Vivian would reply, holding her close. "You were amazing." The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through years of shared struggle and unwavering love. The day Carolina received her college acceptance letter was both the happiest and saddest day of Vivian's life. It wasn't just any acceptance, it came with a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the state. Carolina had worked so hard for this, and Vivian couldn't have been prouder. But pride was mixed with a deep ache. The thought of Carolina leaving their small home, the quiet evenings together replaced by silence, was almost too much to bear. Vivian knew, though, that this was Carolina's chance to build the life she deserved. "You're going to do amazing things," Vivian said, holding the acceptance letter in her trembling hands. She forced a smile, blinking back tears. Carolina noticed, of course. "I'll call you every day, Mum," she said softly, wrapping her arms around Vivian. "You'll see. It'll be like I'm not even gone." Vivian laughed, though her heart ached. "Don't you worry about me, sweetheart. You just focus on your studies. And remember, family is what matters most," Carolina finished, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We take care of each other, no matter what." The day Carolina left for college, Vivian stood on the porch, watching as her daughter's car disappeared down the road. The house felt impossibly quiet after that. Vivian busied herself with her work, trying to ignore the emptiness that had settled in her chest. Carolina's calls were the highlight of Vivian's evenings. No matter how busy her daughter's life became, Carolina always made time to share the details. "Mom," Carolina would begin, her voice buzzing with excitement. "You wouldn't believe what happened in class today." And Vivian would listen, soaking in every word. Carolina often spoke about her professors, who seemed to adore her, and the complex projects she worked on. One evening, she explained an algorithm she'd built for a class assignment. Vivian didn't understand most of it, but hearing the pride in Carolina's voice was enough. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," Vivian would say, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to change the world one day." For Vivian, those phone calls were proof that all the sacrifices had been worth it. Carolina was thriving, her talent and determination shining brighter with each passing day. By the time graduation rolled around, Carolina's achievements had outpaced everyone's expectations. She graduated with honors, her professors calling her a once-in-a-generation talent. At the ceremony, Carolina stood tall, beaming in her cap and gown, scanning the crowd for her mother. Vivian waved enthusiastically, tears streaming down her face as she captured the moment on her old phone. After the ceremony, Carolina pulled Vivian into a tight hug. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she whispered. Vivian laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Oh, honey, this is all you. I just stood on the sidelines cheering." But Carolina shook her head. "No, Mom, you're the reason I'm here, and I'm going to make you proud. Just wait." Carolina's first job was at a prestigious software company in the city. The fast-paced environment seemed to suit her, and she quickly made a name for herself. It wasn't long before her manager began giving her the toughest projects, trusting her to deliver results, no matter the stakes. During one of her frequent calls home, Carolina mentioned a new co-worker. "His name's Javier," she said, her tone light but thoughtful. "He's been helping me with some projects. He's brilliant, Mum. Knows the industry inside and out." Vivian could hear the subtle change in Carolina's voice, the way it softened just a touch when she spoke about him. "He sounds like a smart man," Vivian said cautiously. "He is," Carolina replied. "And he's interesting. Different from anyone I've met." Vivian hummed in response, unsure of what to say. There was something about the way Carolina described Javier that left a knot in her stomach. As weeks turned into months, Javier's name came up more and more. He and Carolina began spending time together outside of work, and their connection deepened. During a visit home, Carolina finally told Vivienne about their relationship. "He's amazing, Mom," Carolina said, her eyes bright. "He challenges me in ways no one else does, and he believes in me, really believes in me." Vivian smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm glad he supports you, sweetheart. That's important." Carolina hesitated, sensing her mother's unease. "You'd like him if you met him," she added quickly. "He's driven, just like me, and he wants the same things I do: success, stability, a future." Vivian nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I just want you to be happy, Carolina. But be careful, okay? Ambition's a good thing, but it can cloud people's judgment sometimes. Just make sure he's the person you think he is." Carolina's expression tightened for a moment, but she nodded. "I will, Mom. I promise." Javier and Carolina's relationship blossomed quickly. Their shared ambition led them to start a business together, a software company focused on app development. The venture took off almost immediately, their complementary skills driving its success. Carolina handled the technical side, while Javier managed the business and marketing. But as the company grew, cracks began to show. Javier's decisiveness, which Carolina had once admired, sometimes veered into control. He had a way of brushing off her ideas, insisting that his approach was better. Carolina often let it slide, convincing herself it was just his passion for the business. When she brought up these concerns during one of her calls with Vivian, her mother's voice was firm. "Don't let anyone, not even Javier, make you feel small, Carolina. You've worked too hard to have your voice silenced." "I know, Mom," Carolina replied, though doubt lingered in her voice. "I just think he gets caught up in the moment. He doesn't mean anything by it." Vivian wanted to say more, but held back. She knew Carolina needed to navigate this on her own, even if her motherly instincts screamed otherwise. Months later, during another visit home, Carolina dropped the news. "Javier proposed," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. Vivian's heart sank. She forced a smile, though her mind raced with questions. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Have you thought it through?" Carolina frowned. "What do you mean?" "Of course I have. Javier and I are perfect together, Mom. We've built a life together." "I know," Vivian said gently. "But marriage is a big step. It's not just about love. It's about trust, partnership. Are you sure he's the one?" Carolina's face hardened. "Why can't you just be happy for me?" Vivian sighed, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I want nothing more than for you to be happy. But as your mum, it's my job to ask the hard questions. Just think about it a little longer, okay?" Carolina pulled her hand away, her jaw tightening. "I've thought about it, Mom. I love him. and I wish you'd trust me to make my own decisions." As Carolina left that evening, Vivian sat alone in the quiet house, her chest heavy with worry. Something about Javier didn't sit right with her, but she knew Carolina's heart was already set. "Please," Vivian whispered into the empty room, "let me be wrong this time." Carolina's decision to marry Javier came faster than Vivian could have imagined. One evening, Carolina called, her tone clipped and her words rushed, almost like she was racing to get through the conversation. "Mom, I need you to understand something," Carolina started. "Javier and I are getting married soon. We're not waiting any longer." Vivian froze, gripping the phone tightly. "Soon? What do you mean, Carolina? You've barely told me anything about the wedding." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Mum, it's just easier this way. We're keeping it small, intimate. It's what Javier wants." "What Javier wants?" Vivian repeated, her voice sharp. She could feel her frustration building, but she tried to keep her tone measured. "Sweetheart, this is your wedding. Shouldn't it be what you want?" "I do want this," Carolina said quickly, though her voice wavered slightly. "Javier and I agreed it's the best thing for us. You don't have to worry about me, Mom." But Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wedding came and went, without so much as an invitation to Vivian. The news reached her through a distant relative who had seen pictures online. Carolina in a simple white dress, Javier smiling broadly as they exchanged vows. Vivian stared at the images on her phone, her heart breaking. She wanted to believe that Carolina was happy, that the decision had been hers. But the nagging doubts remained. It wasn't just the wedding itself, it was how distant Carolina had become, how every conversation seemed strained, as though she were tiptoeing around something unspoken. After the wedding, Javier's control became more apparent. He began dictating nearly every aspect of Carolina's life, from her work schedule to her social circle. Friends who had once been close to her noticed the change almost immediately. "She never comes out anymore," one friend confided to Vivian during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "I've tried calling her, but she barely picks up. When she does, she sounds off, like she's scared or something." Vivian's chest tightened. She'd noticed the same thing in her own calls with Carolina. Her once vibrant daughter sounded muted, her words careful, as if she were weighing every sentence before speaking. The turning point came one cold morning when Vivian received an unexpected message. It was from one of Carolina's college friends, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Carolina passed away. Javier said it was a stroke. I thought you should know." The words didn't make sense at first. Vivian read the message over and over, hoping she'd misunderstood, but the meaning remained the same. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not my Carolina." Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, but the friend had little else to offer. "Javier's arranging the funeral," they said. "He's keeping it private, family only." Family only. The words stung. How could Javier call it a family event and exclude her? The morning of the funeral was cold and grey, as though the weather itself mourned. Vivian sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding against her ribs. The drive had been long and grueling, each mile filled with memories of Carolina. Her first steps, her bright laugh, the way she'd always insisted on calling her mother every Sunday night without fail. And now, here she was, fighting for the chance to say goodbye to her daughter. When Vivian arrived at the funeral home, she was met with an atmosphere heavy with tension. A small crowd had gathered, their faces somber, but there was a distance in their eyes when they noticed her. Vivienne ignored the murmurs and whispers, her focus solely on the man standing near the casket. Javier. Her chest tightened at the sight of him. He looked polished, his black suit pristine, but there was something too composed about him. His smile was thin, his eyes scanning the crowd as if calculating his next move. When his gaze landed on Vivienne, his expression hardened. "Vivienne?" Javier said, his voice low and measured as she approached. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm her mother," Vivienne shot back, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have every right to be here." "This isn't the time for drama," Javier replied, his tone sharp. "Carolina wouldn't want that. Vivienne stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "And you think she'd want her own mother barred from her funeral? What are you hiding, Javier?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment Vivienne thought she saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, straightening his posture. "I'm not hiding anything," he said firmly. "This is about respect. She passed peacefully, and we should honor that." "Then let me see her," Vivienne said, her voice trembling now. "Let me say goodbye to my daughter." Javier's hand shot out to block her path. "No," he said, his tone final. "It's better. This way." The room fell silent as the tension between them grew. Vivienne could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the whispers growing louder in her mind. She took a step back, her hands shaking, but then she turned to the crowd. "I don't know what he's told you," she began, her voice strong despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "But something isn't right here. I can feel it. I'm begging you. Help me see my daughter." A murmur rippled through the room. Javier's composed mask slipped, his voice rising with desperation. "This is insane. She's gone, Vivienne. Let her rest in peace." But Vivienne didn't back down. She turned to the nearest person, a woman holding a tissue to her face. "Please," Vivienne said, her voice breaking. "If you've ever lost someone you love, you know how much this means. I just need to see her one last time." The woman hesitated, then nodded slightly. Others in the crowd began to murmur their agreement, stepping aside as Vivienne moved toward the casket. Javier tried to intercept her again, but this time a man in the crowd spoke up. "Let her through," he said, his voice firm. "She's her mother. She deserves this." Vivienne didn't wait for Javier to respond. She pushed past him, her hands trembling as she reached for the lid of the casket. For a moment, she hesitated, bracing herself for the sight of her daughter lifeless inside. When she lifted the lid, a collective gasp filled the room. Carolina lay still, her face pale, but there was a faint rise and fall to her chest. Vivienne's breath caught in her throat as she leaned closer, her fingers brushing against her daughter's hand. "She's breathing," Vivienne whispered, then louder. "She's breathing." Javier's face went white as the crowd erupted in chaos. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of someone dialing 911. "Call an ambulance!" Vivienne cried, her voice shaking with urgency. "She's alive! Someone help her!" Within minutes, paramedics arrived, the sound of sirens cutting through the commotion. Vivienne refused to leave Carolina's side, clutching her daughter's hand as they lifted her onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics glanced at Vivienne, his expression serious. "She's in critical condition, but she's alive. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Vivienne nodded, her grip tightening on Carolina's hand. "I'm coming with her," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Javier, meanwhile, stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. As the paramedics wheeled Carolina out, Vivian turned to him, her eyes blazing. "What did you do to her?" she demanded, her voice low but filled with fury. Javier opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, a man stepped forward from the crowd. "Excuse me," the man said, pulling out a badge. "Detective Marcus. I think we need to have a conversation." Javier's face twisted with fear as the detective gestured for him to step aside. Vivian didn't wait to hear the rest. Her only focus was Carolina, her daughter, her miracle. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Vivian sat at Carolina's bedside, her fingers gently brushing against her daughter's pale hand. Carolina's chest rose and fell steadily now, but the memory of how close she had come to losing her still clung to Vivian like a dark cloud. "She's stable for now," the doctor had said earlier, "but it's a good thing you acted quickly. Another hour and—" He hadn't needed to finish the sentence. Vivian knew. She'd been moments away from burying her child alive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Detective Marcus stepped in, his expression a mix of professional calm and personal concern. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "can we talk?" Vivian glanced at Carolina, then back at the detective. She nodded, rising from her chair and motioning for him to step into the hallway. "I thought you'd want an update," Marcus began, keeping his voice low. "We've got Javier in custody. He's not talking much, but what we've pieced together so far—" He hesitated, as though unsure how much to share. "Just tell me," Vivian said firmly. Marcus sighed. "We found evidence that Javier purchased a large quantity of sedatives recently, the type he used on Carolina. He was planning this for weeks, maybe longer. Our theory is he wanted her incapacitated long enough to fake her death and gain control of her assets. The funeral was his way of sealing the deal before anyone could ask questions." Vivian's stomach turned, and she pressed a hand against the wall for support. "He was going to steal everything she built," she whispered, her voice tinged with both anger and disbelief. Marcus nodded. "It looks that way, but he slipped up. Carolina's survival throws a wrench in his plans. We'll get a full confession out of him. It's just a matter of time." Back in the hospital room, Vivian sat by Carolina's side once more. She watched as her daughter stirred, her eyelids fluttering weakly. When Carolina's eyes finally opened, they were unfocused at first, but then they found Vivienne. "Mum!" Carolina's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I'm here, baby," Vivienne said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here." Carolina tried to sit up, but Vivienne gently pressed her back down. "Don't move too much. You need to rest." "What happened?" Carolina asked, confusion knitting her brow. Vivienne hesitated. How could she explain the nightmare her daughter had narrowly escaped? "You were hurt," she said carefully. "But you're safe now. That's all that matters." Carolina's eyes filled with tears as bits and pieces of memory came flooding back. "Javier," she whispered, her voice trembling. He gave me something. I couldn't move, couldn't fight back." "It's okay," Vivian said, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. "He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." As the days passed, Carolina grew stronger. She listened in quiet shock as Vivian recounted everything: the rushed funeral, Javier's refusal to let her see the body, and the moment Vivian realized Carolina was still alive. "I didn't want to believe he was capable of something so horrible," Carolina said one evening, her voice heavy with regret. "How could I have been so blind, Mom? I trusted him. I loved him." Vivian reached for her daughter's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. You couldn't have known. People like Javier, they're good at hiding who they really are. But what matters is that you're here, and you're safe." Carolina nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving me, for not giving up on me." Vivian smiled, though her own tears threatened to spill. "You're my daughter," she said simply. "I'd fight the whole world for you if I had to." The day of Javier's court hearing arrived quickly. Vivian sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched him being led into the courtroom. He looked smaller, somehow, his usual arrogance replaced with a nervous energy that betrayed his fear. When the charges were read, Javier's lawyer stood to enter a plea. "Not guilty," the lawyer said, his voice steady despite the murmurs that rippled through the room. Vivian felt her anger flare, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on Javier. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes said everything. A week later, Vivian visited the courthouse again, this time as a witness. As she stepped into the courtroom, her gaze met Javier's for the first time since the hospital. He avoided her eyes, his shoulders slumping as though her presence alone was too much to bear. When Vivian took the stand, she spoke with calm determination, recounting everything she had seen and done. She described the funeral, the casket, and the moment she realized Carolina was still alive. Every word was laced with the quiet fury of a mother who had come too close to losing her child. Javier sat motionless, his head bowed, as Vivian's testimony painted him as the calculating manipulator he was. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about his guilt. The judge's gavel struck sharply against the bench, silencing the low hum of whispers that had filled the courtroom moments before. "Javier Martinez," the judge announced, his voice firm and deliberate. "You have been found guilty of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 10 years. The weight of the sentence hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Javier, once so confident and in control, sat as if frozen. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, the mask of arrogance slipped entirely from his face, leaving only the shell of a man who had lost everything. From her seat, Vivian felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, that her daughter was safe from his reach. Sadness that Carolina's trust had been so cruelly betrayed by someone she had once loved. Carolina stood outside the courthouse alongside Vivienne, her eyes fixed on the grey sky above. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Vivian reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over," she echoed. But as she looked at Carolina's weary expression, she knew this wasn't the end of the journey. Healing would take time, for both of them. In the weeks that followed, Carolina faced the monumental task of reclaiming her life. The company she had built with Javier was in turmoil, its reputation tarnished by the scandal. Many of the employees were uncertain about the future, and the weight of leadership fell squarely on Carolina's shoulders. With Vivian's support, Carolina began the painstaking process of rebuilding. She met with the company's core team, addressing their concerns with honesty and transparency. "I won't lie to you," she told them in one meeting, her voice steady despite the doubt she felt. "The road ahead won't be easy, but if we work together, I know we can make this company something to be proud of again." The words were met with cautious nods, but a few of her employees, those who had stood by her through thick and thin, offered genuine encouragement. "You've always been the heart of this place," one senior developer said. "We're with you, Carolina." Despite her determination, the stress took its toll. Carolina often worked late into the night, poring over financial reports and brainstorming strategies to rebuild the company's image. Vivienne noticed the toll it was taking on her daughter. One evening, Vivienne found Carolina sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. A stack of papers sat in front of her, untouched. "Sweetheart," Vivienne said softly, setting a cup of tea on the table, "you're pushing yourself too hard." "I have to," Carolina replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let this happen, Mom. I have to fix it." Vivienne pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. "You didn't let anything happen," she said firmly. "Javier made his choices, and none of that is your fault. But you can't rebuild anything if you break yourself in the process." Carolina looked at her mother, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, "for everything, for not listening to you, for shutting you out." Vivienne reached across the table, taking Carolina's hands in her own. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You're here, you're safe. And that's all that matters to me." Carolina nodded, her tears spilling over. She leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling a sense of comfort she hadn't allowed herself in months. Over time, Carolina found her footing again. The company slowly regained its reputation, and with each small victory, Carolina's confidence grew. Vivienne was there for every step, offering advice when asked and quiet encouragement when words weren't enough. At home, their bond deepened in ways neither had expected. Vivienne taught Carolina how to cook the meals she had grown up with, simple dishes that carried memories of better days. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, they laughed and shared stories, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the lightness of the present. One afternoon, as they prepared dinner together, Carolina paused, her hands covered in flour from kneading dough. "Mom," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how close I came to losing everything." Vivienne looked up from chopping vegetables, her expression curious but patient. Carolina continued, "I've realized that nothing, not success, not love, not ambition, means as much as family. You were right. You've always been right." Vivienne smiled, setting down the knife. "You had to find your own way," she said gently. "And you did. That's what matters." Carolina stepped forward and hugged her mother tightly. "I won't let anyone or anything come between us again," she said, her voice steady with resolve. Months turned into a year, and Carolina blossomed into a stronger, wiser version of herself. She found a new rhythm, one that balanced her work and personal life. She spent evenings with Vivienne, sharing meals and laughter, and weekends hiking trails or exploring the nearby countryside. The nightmares that had plagued her after the incident faded, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. She was alive. She was loved. And she was determined to live her life fully, unburdened by fear or regret. The story of Vivienne and Carolina is a deeply moving narrative of resilience, love, and redemption. Vivienne's unwavering determination to protect her daughter, even against insurmountable odds, demonstrates the boundless strength of a mother's love. From facing betrayal to uncovering a sinister plot, Vivienne's courage shines as she fights to save Carolina from danger and reclaim their lives. Carolina's journey, on the other hand, is one of growth and self-discovery. Her initial trust and ambition lead her into a relationship that blinds her to warning signs. However, through heartbreak and near tragedy, she learns the importance of family and the irreplaceable value of trust and support. Carolina's eventual recovery and empowerment show that even in the face of betrayal, one can rise stronger and wiser. The story beautifully underscores the significance of family bonds. It teaches us that love and perseverance can conquer even the darkest trials. Moreover, it emphasizes the importance of listening to intuition and the wisdom of loved ones. In the end, Vivian and Carolina's triumph is not just in overcoming adversity, but in rediscovering the strength and joy found in each other. It's a poignant reminder that family, when nurtured, can be the greatest source of hope and healing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.